A sealed mining tunnel in Montana lay untouched for 120 years until a drilling crew broke through and found something no one expected. What they uncovered rewrote local history and revealed a century-old betrayal. Stay tuned, hit like, and subscribe to follow this true story of silent sacrifice and redemption. The first envelope arrived on a cold March morning, thick with documents and the faint scent of old metal and paper. Elliot Graves turned it over in his hands, his thumb tracing the embossed seal of Western Mineral Holdings, a company he knew by reputation efficient and secretive. He'd worked jobs for dozens of firms like this, reopening forgotten tunnels across the West, but something about the phrasing in this contract made him pause. Restoration of access to the Hallow Ridge mine sealed in 1904 under emergency protocol. The words had a chill to them. Outside snow clung to the mountain edges under the blue Montana sky. Elliot's life had always been measured in stone, and sound, the whir of drills, the hum of generators, but now there was something quieter between the lines of this job, an unease he couldn't quite name. Mariah Quinn arrived that afternoon, her camera bag slung over one shoulder, a press badge clipped to her jacket. She was younger, brisk, sharp-eyed, the sort of person who saw stories in the dust of forgotten places. "You're really going up there?" she asked, setting down her recorder. Elliot nodded, not looking up from the spread of maps. "They're paying well," he said, "and it's just another hole in the mountain." But he didn't sound convinced. As they reviewed the company dossier, Mariah frowned. "Western Mineral Holdings," she murmured. "They operated as Hallow Mining Company until 1906, then reappeared as Western Mineral Holdings after a 1921 reorganization." Elliot looked up sharply. He hadn't known that. "Same people, different names," she continued. "After a collapse killed several workers, the company vanished for decades, rebranded." She flipped through the pages until she found a faded list of miners. Her finger stopped halfway down. "Harold Byrne," she read aloud. Elliot froze. The name stirred something buried deep, like a nail catching the edge of a memory. He remembered his grandmother's quiet voice telling stories of a distant cousin who never came home from the mines. Harold Byrne. The connection was faint, but real. Elliot leaned closer, scanning the brittle pages. In the corner of one sheet, nearly illegible, was a scrawled note. "Team 7, Supervisor Harold Byrne, relation to G family line." He traced the ink with his thumb, a cold realization blooming in his chest. His own family line. He tried to laugh it off to tell Mariah it was coincidence, but his voice wavered. "Old name, common one," he said. She didn't argue. Instead, she studied him for a long moment before saying softly, "Maybe this isn't just another hole in the mountain." That night, Elliot couldn't sleep. The wind howled across the plains, rattling the tin roof of his workshop. He sat at his desk reviewing blueprints under the glow of a single lamp. The last diagram showed a mile-deep main shaft with several lateral veins marked in pencil. The final mark on the drawing was a solid wall of concrete, dated June 1904. No explanation, no repair notes, just a red stamp, sealed by order of management. He flipped to the next document, an archived newspaper clipping, yellowed and frayed. "Mine tragedy at Hallow Ridge," the headline read. The article described an explosion, a collapse, a handful of survivors rescued, but dozens unaccounted for. And then silence. No follow-up, no investigation. Elliot rubbed his temples. The deeper he read, the less it felt like history, and the more it felt like an unfinished story. By dawn, his decision was made. He called Mariah. "We're taking the job," he said, his voice steady but low. "If they want to open that tunnel, they'll have to face what's buried inside." She met him later that morning at the site office, breath misting in the cold air. Her camera hung ready. "You really think there's more to it?" she asked. Elliot zipped up his jacket and glanced toward the horizon where Hallow Ridge rose silent and gray against the sky. "I don't think," he said quietly. "I know." The company foreman handed him the final permits, smiling too easily. "All legal," he said. "Just another reclamation project." Elliot signed, though the weight of his pen felt heavier than usual. When he looked at the signature line, his own name seemed to echo faintly against that of the man lost long ago, 2 graves bound by time and stone. As he loaded his truck with surveying gear, he caught Mariah watching him. Her expression was serious, now the excitement from earlier replaced by something gentler, concern. Maybe curiosity. "Why does it feel like you've been here before?" she asked. Elliot gave a thin smile, closing the tailgate. "Maybe I have." When they pulled out of town, the morning light caught the windshield, and for a fleeting second, Elliot thought he saw the reflection of the mountain ahead, a dark, silent ridge that seemed almost to breathe. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. The past was waiting for him, and this time it bore his own name. The convoy wound its way up the narrow mountain road, engines growling under the weight of steel equipment and fuel drums. Morning fog blanketed Hallow Ridge, muting the world to gray. Elliot Graves sat in the lead truck, both hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the road as though focus alone could keep the mountain still. Behind him, the crew talked in low voices, men who'd drilled through half the Rockies, but had never seen a site sealed this long. Mariah Quinn rode shotgun beside him, jotting notes in a small leather book, occasionally glancing out the window at the landscape that swallowed sound. "It feels untouched," she murmured, "like no one's been here for a century." Elliot nodded without looking. "That's about right." When they reached the clearing, the entrance to the mine appeared not as a gaping wound, but as a flat gray scar against the rock face, an unbroken wall of concrete mottled by time, streaked with rust. Faded lettering read, "Hallow Ridge Number 3 Shaft, half swallowed by moss." The air was thin, dry, and metallic. Elliot climbed out, checked the ground stability, and called the team to unload the drill rig. "Keep it steady," he said. "We'll core sample before we cut." His voice carried the weight of practiced caution, but even he could feel the strange stillness of the place pressing against his ribs. Mariah began filming as the crew set up her lens, sweeping thoughtfully across the sealed wall, then pausing on the surrounding terrain. "You said this mine closed after an explosion," she asked. Elliot pulled off his gloves, flipping through a folder of copies from the company's archive. "The records say that he said, but they don't say what happened afterward." He turned a page and frowned. No rescue reports, no insurance claims, no follow-up inspections. It's as if they just stopped. Mariah's brow furrowed. "That doesn't make sense. Even back then they documented accidents." Elliot sighed, the sound lost in the steady wind. Unless someone didn't want it documented. They worked in silence for several hours, the rhythmic clang of tools echoing off the ridge. The drill's hum built slowly into a low vibration that seemed to sink into the ground itself. Elliot oversaw every measurement, careful not to penetrate too deep, until the structure was confirmed stable. Mariah, meanwhile, sat on the tailgate of a supply truck, scanning through microfilm printouts she had borrowed from the state archives. The more she read, the more her expression darkened. "Elliot," she called out after a while, her voice hesitant. "You need to see this." He walked over, wiping grit from his hands. She held up a page from an old ledger, the handwriting neat and formal. "It lists all the miners stationed here in 1904, she said. "But half the names are crossed out, not marked deceased, just removed." She flipped to another document. "And these are worker correspondence logs. Letters from family members asking about the collapse. None of them received replies." Elliot took the pages, eyes narrowing. The ink was faded, but legible enough to tell a story of absence, not disaster, but silence. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "Montana Historical Records," she replied. "They weren't in the company's files. These were in a private donation box, misfiled under property deeds. Someone kept them out of sight." He turned to face the concrete wall again, its surface cold and immovable. "They buried more than a tunnel," he said quietly. By late afternoon, the drill hit the first core depth. Elliot examined the extracted concrete dense uniform, poured in multiple lifts to a thickness far beyond period safety bulkheads, more like a permanent bulkhead than an emergency seal. He frowned, running a thumb along the inner edge. This wasn't emergency work, he muttered. This was permanent. One of the technicians, a younger man with a clipboard, glanced over. "You mean they meant to close it for good?" Elliot didn't answer. His mind was tracing every structural detail, every report, every missing page. Mariah joined him, camera hanging at her side. If they sealed it intentionally, she said there must have been a reason. Elliot looked at her eyes, tired but intent. "There's always a reason," he said. "The question is whether it was safety or shame." The temperature began to drop as the sun slipped behind the ridge. Long shadows crawled across the clearing, stretching toward the sealed mouth of the mine. The crew packed up for the day, their laughter subdued their boots crunching on gravel. Elliot stayed studying the wall as if it might reveal something. Mariah stood beside him, notebook in hand. "What if the people who were trapped never got out?" she asked softly. Elliot's gaze didn't move from the wall. "Then this mountain's been holding its breath for 120 years, he said. His voice was almost a whisper. "And we're about to break the seal." Mariah closed her notebook, the snap of the cover echoing in the thin air. Neither of them spoke after that. Behind them, the drill sat idle, a metal silhouette against the pale sky. Elliot exhaled slowly, the sound carried away by the wind, and in the fading light of Hallow Ridge, the sealed tunnel loomed like a question no one had dared to ask in over a century. By the fourth morning, the mountain had become a rhythm. In itself, drill rotations, shifts, the muffled roar of machinery echoing off the cold stone. Elliot Graves stood near the rig, his breath turning to mist in the thin air, the sound of metal against rock rolling through his bones. Days had blurred together since they first broke ground at Hallow Ridge. Each hour, chipping away at a wall, meant never to be touched again. The air was dry, heavy with dust, and the faint tang of oil. Mariah Quinn filmed from a distance, camera steady despite the tremor of the earth under her boots. The team moved with mechanical precision, the hum of labor settling into a kind of uneasy silence between bursts of drilling. Elliot checked pressure readings on the monitor, his face marked with exhaustion, but sharpened by focus. "We're close," one of the crewmen said, adjusting the depth gauge. "Maybe another foot." Elliot nodded without looking up. "Slow it down. We don't know what's behind it yet." The drill groaned, slicing through concrete unseen for a century. The vibration deepened, a steady pulse that seemed to match Elliot's heartbeat. Then, with a dull, shuddering crack, the drill bit broke through. The sound was followed by a long sigh from within the mountain, like air escaping after holding its breath for too long. A wave of dust exploded outward, coating everyone in fine gray powder. The crew stepped back, coughing as Elliot hit the kill switch. Silence followed. The mountain, once filled with the constant growl of machinery, seemed suddenly alive in its quiet. Elliot wiped his goggles clean and leaned forward, peering into the small opening they had carved. A faint draft brushed against his face, cold, dry, metallic. "Ventilation's still moving," he murmured, surprised. "Natural fractures must be feeding a slow draft through the ridge. Dry air like this would keep paper and cloth from rotting." "That means there's space back there." Mariah lowered her camera, her voice barely audible. After all this time, Elliot nodded, motioning for the team to widen the breach. As they pried away chunks of concrete, a rush of air carried with it a strange scent, old wood rust, something faintly acidic. When the dust finally settled, a dark void stared back at them. "Light it," Elliot ordered softly. The first beam of a headlamp cut through the haze, revealing a narrow passage descending at a gentle slope. Wooden supports lined the walls, blackened with age but still intact. The ground was littered with fragments of rock and decayed timbers. Mariah stepped closer, her boots crunching on the gravel. "It's like time stopped," she whispered. Elliot's lamp followed the tunnel's curve, catching on the outline of something half buried in debris. He knelt, brushing away dirt to reveal the corroded edge of a mining cart. The metal was pitted and flaked, but the wheel still turned slightly under his hand. "It's original," he said half to himself. They left in a hurry. Mariah raised her camera, capturing the image in silence. Nearby, another crew member unearthed a tool rack fixed to the wall. the handles of pickaxes worn smooth but preserved by the dry air. It was as if the miners had stepped out for lunch and never returned. Elliot moved slowly, eyes scanning every detail. The placement of tools, the slope of the floor, the faint marks carved into the beams. They were still working when it sealed. He set his tone low, almost reverent. One of the workers called out from the far end of the newly opened shaft. "Boss, you'll want to see this." Elliot and Mariah followed the air thick with suspended dust motes glimmering in the beams of their lamps. The worker pointed toward a cluster of wooden crates stacked against the far wall. The planks warped, but largely unbroken. Symbols were stenciled onto the sides, triangular warning marks faded with age. Elliot crouched beside one, tracing the faint lettering with his glove. The word explosives barely showed through the grime. His stomach tightened. "Step back," he said quietly. "Don't touch anything until we secure it." The team froze the gravity of his tone cutting through the air. Mariah steadied her breathing, the lens of her camera catching the ghostly warning sign under the dust. Elliot examined the crate more closely, noticing the residue of crystallized powder seeping from the seams. "It's nitroglycerin-based," he said. "Unstable even when it's new. 100 years of pressure could have turned it volatile." He glanced up at the ceiling supports, their wood dry and brittle. "If these go, so does everything above us." The room seemed to shrink around them. The hum of machinery outside had stopped. Only the faint sound of dripping water somewhere deeper in the tunnel filled the silence. Elliot straightened slowly. "We'll seal off this section for now," he told the crew. "Nobody goes near those crates until we know they're safe." Mariah lowered her camera, her voice a whisper. "They sealed it for a reason." Elliot looked at her dust, streaking the lines of his face. "Yes," he said, eyes drifting toward the darkness beyond the tunnel's bend. "But I don't think it was just for the explosives." The words hung between them, quiet and heavy, as the air from within the mountain breathed past them, once again colder this time, carrying with it the scent of rust and something faintly human. The next morning broke cold, and still the mountain silent except for the faint clatter of tools as Elliot's team prepared to move deeper. The air in the newly opened shaft was different now, thicker, mustier, heavy, with the scent of decay and old metal. Elliot adjusted the beam of his headlamp, sending a narrow cone of light cutting through the haze. "Stay close and watch your footing," he said, voice echoing against the low ceiling. The group advanced in a slow line, the crunch of gravel beneath their boots marking the first human movement in this tunnel since 1904. Behind him, Mariah filmed quietly, her camera capturing the rhythmic sway of headlamps in the dark. The corridor narrowed, forcing them to stoop. Support beams rose every few feet, splintered but still firm. Elliot paused to run a hand across one, tracing initials carved into the surface. Letters blurred by time. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. "Someone wanted to be remembered," he murmured. Mariah looked over his shoulder, her breath visible in the cold air. "Do you think they knew they wouldn't make it out?" Elliot didn't answer. He raised his lamp higher, scanning the walls. The rock bore marks, sharp, deliberate strikes, not random fractures from an explosion. His engineer's eye caught the pattern instantly. "These aren't collapse lines," he said. "The fractures feather back toward the blocking face. There's no soot deposition on the caps, and the wedge pattern is too uniform for a blast. This was done by hand." The team gathered close, examining the stone. Each mark was uniform, chiseled inward, as if someone had been sealing rather than escaping. Elliot's pulse quickened. He pressed his palm against the rock face, feeling the cold smoothness where tools had scraped decades ago. "This wasn't a cave-in," he said, voice low. "Someone closed this on purpose." Mariah's camera whirred softly as she zoomed in on the marks. "You mean they trapped them?" Elliot's expression tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he continued forward, moving cautiously around a bend where the tunnel widened. Piles of rock blocked half the passage, and their lamps caught on something half buried in the debris. "Hold the light steady," Elliot called. Together they cleared away loose stones, the sound of their efforts echoing through the corridor. Slowly, a curved piece of metal emerged, then a wheel, then the frame of an old mining cart, its surface eaten with rust. The cart's front end was crushed inward against the hand-packed choke frozen mid-motion as the artificial barricade swallowed the line. Elliot crouched, brushing his gloves across the bent rim. This was the main line, he said. If they were trying to escape, this is where they would have come through. He followed the rails with his light. They disappeared into the collapsed section of wall. The steel track ended abruptly, swallowed by the rockfall. Mariah stepped closer, filming the twisted metal. They were this close, she whispered. Elliot's gaze moved upward, where fragments of old timber still clung to the ceiling. He studied the way the beams intersected the unnatural compression angles. No, he said quietly. They never had a chance. The track terminates inside a packed choke, and the cap timbers are compressed from the seal side. The realization pressed down on him, heavy as the mountain itself. These men hadn't died from accident or negligence, they'd been entombed. A rattle of gravel made him glance back. Danny had brushed a beam, sending dust down on his helmet. Careful, Elliot warned. Everything in air is older than your grandparents. Danny nodded, stepping back, his light darting nervously along the walls. You think someone ordered the closure, he asked. Elliot hesitated before answering. There's no record of a rescue attempt, he said. No follow-up, no recovery. A company doesn't forget something like that. It hides it. Mariah met his eyes, the reflection of his headlamp glinting off her lens. Then this isn't just a dig, she said softly. It's evidence. Her words hung in the cold air, mingling with the soft hum of the equipment outside. Elliot turned away, scanning the ground again. Near the collapsed section, he noticed a faint groove carved into the dirt, a track worn smooth by years of repetition to the path of the cart's wheels before it stopped forever. He crouched and picked up a fragment of iron, the edge polished from contact. They were trying to move fast, he said. Look at the wear. They loaded something heavy, probably supplies or tools. They must have known something was coming. Mariah's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Or someone. Elliot didn't reply. He stood brushing the dust from his gloves and looked down the tunnel's dark curve. The air grew colder there, and a faint draft touched his cheek. Somewhere beyond the debris, the passage continued. He could feel it, a hollow space waiting. We'll need to clear part of this section, he said finally. But carefully. No charges. No heavy drills. Hand tools only. The team exchanged uneasy glances but obeyed. As the first chisels struck stone, the sharp metallic sound carried far down the shaft, echoing back, like a memory of labor long past. Elliot watched the dust rise in thin spirals, thinking of the marks on the walls, and the cart frozen mid-flight. Someone had built this tomb with intent. Someone had decided silence was easier than rescue. Mariah lowered her camera, her eyes reflecting the flicker of light. Whatever's behind that wall, she said, it's not just history anymore. Elliot nodded once the motion slow, deliberate. His lamp caught the glint of metal buried deeper in the rock, something beyond the collapse waiting to be seen. By the end of the week, the crew had carved a narrow passage through the collapsed section. Each chisel strike echoed like metal biting stone through the mountain's silence. Elliot Graves worked side by side with his team, his gloves coated in dust, his lamp beam cutting through the haze. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became until it felt thick enough to breathe. He could sense it, something waiting on the other side of the rock, something human. When the final slab shifted loose, a rush of cold air spilled out sharp and dry. Elliot held up his hand for the team to pause. Dust swirled through their lights like snow in still air. Ventilation, he said quietly. There's an open space beyond. They pried the last stones free, revealing a narrow chamber lined with collapsed beams. Elliot ducked through first, his boots crunching over fragments of timber. The air smelled of rust, old fabric, and faintly of something organic, long faded. His headlamp caught the dull gleam of metal cans scattered across the floor, their labels peeled away by time. He crouched, picking one up gently. It crumbled in his hand. Mariah Quinn followed behind him, her camera steady but her breathing uneven. "Is this a storage area?" she asked. Elliot shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "This was a shelter." As their lights swept the room, the shapes became clearer. Bedrolls flattened by decay tools laid neatly beside them, and against the far wall lay the remains of no fewer than 12 men, their bones arranged in a tight circle, as if for warmth. Elliot took a step closer, his chest tightening. A skull rested against the side of a crate, its jaw slightly open. The sight pulled the air from the room. "My God." Mariah whispered, her voice barely audible. Elliot knelt beside the nearest skeleton. The bones were intact, undisturbed, the position unmistakable. These men hadn't fallen. They had waited. He noticed the remnants of a lunch pail beside one of them. The rusted handle still looped through bony fingers. "They were alive down here," he said, his voice rough with disbelief. "They stayed until the end." The team stood in silence, no one daring to speak. Mariah's camera lens trembled as she focused on the scene. Near the wall, Elliot spotted a wooden box half buried in debris. He cleared the dirt away carefully, revealing faint stenciled markings, Hallow Mining Company supplies. Inside were tin cups, a worn Bible, and several folded scraps of paper, their ink blurred but still legible. Elliot unfolded one, squinting in the dim light. The handwriting was firm, deliberate. "They told us help was coming." Then we heard the concrete. He lowered the page slowly, his throat tight. Mariah read over his shoulder, her expression hollow. "They sealed them in," she said. Elliot didn't respond. The realization pressed against his chest like a weight. He stood scanning the chamber. The miners had tried to survive rationing supplies, waiting for rescue that never came. The neat cans and tools spoke of men clinging to order amid abandonment. "They must have known," he murmured. "When the air started to thin, when the drills never came back, they must have known no one was coming." Mariah panned the camera slowly, her voice shaking. Who could do this? Elliot looked back at the entrance, the wall they had broken through. Someone who found the cost of rescue higher than silence. He took another step, the beam of his lamp catching on something gleaming near the corner. He bent to retrieve it, a metal tag, tarnished but still legible. He brushed away the grime with his thumb, revealing a name punched into the surface, H. Burn on 27. For a moment, the sound of the wind outside seemed to vanish. Mariah watched him carefully. "That name again," she said. Elliot's voice dropped to a whisper. "Harold Byrne. My family." The others exchanged glances, unsure what to say. He turned the tag over in his palm, feeling its edges bite faintly into his skin. This wasn't history anymore. It was personal. They radioed for the state investigators to document the find, but Elliot couldn't bring himself to leave the chamber. He stayed by the remains as the others set up lights and cameras. The investigators confirmed what he already knew: the bodies were from the early 20th century. No evidence of explosion trauma, no sign of rescue attempts. The tunnel had been sealed deliberately. Mariah stood beside him, her tone quiet. They knew people were still alive when they poured the concrete. Elliot nodded once. And they did it anyway. One of the technicians held up another artifact, a small tin cup, etched with initials. TG. He flipped through the archival list Mariah had brought, eyes scanning the names. "Thomas Grady," she said. "His great-granddaughter still lives in Helena." Elliot felt something inside him twist. The past wasn't gone. It was standing all around them, asking to be seen. He looked at the circle of bones again, the hands still resting near one another, as if in silent companionship. "We'll make sure they're remembered," he said softly. Mariah lowered her camera, her expression unreadable. "And we'll make sure the truth isn't buried again." Elliot didn't answer. He only looked toward the darkness beyond the chamber, where the tunnel continued deeper, the faint echo of dripping water marking the rhythm of time still passing in the place where so many had been left behind. For 2 days, the chamber became both a crime scene and a memorial. The air was heavy with dust and quiet reverence as state investigators cataloged artifacts, while Elliot Graves and Mariah Quinn worked side by side to record everything that could still speak. Mariah photographed every item with deliberate care. The rusted lunch tins, the folded clothing, the makeshift shelters built from splintered beams. Elliot, meanwhile, sat at a small field table near the tunnel wall, a spread of yellowed documents before him. He compared each nameplate and initial against the miner's registry. The farther he read, the harder it became to steady his hands. 32 men, he said softly, half to himself. And none of them ever listed as recovered. Mariah glanced up from her notebook. "Do you think anyone tried to save them?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on a company ledger marked June 1904 Incident Report. The entry ended abruptly after 3 lines, structural collapse at South Shaft. Immediate closure ordered for safety. All operations ceased. Nothing more. No rescue details, no timeline, no survivors. He exhaled the sound slow and deliberate. They didn't even pretend to try, he said. Mariah moved closer, kneeling beside a crate she had been cleaning. "Elliot," she said quietly, "you should see this." Inside the crate was a small, oil-stained notebook bound in leather, its spine cracked with age. The initials HB were pressed into the cover. Elliot felt his stomach tighten. He lifted it carefully, brushing away a layer of grit. The paper inside was brittle but legible, written in pencil that had faded to a soft gray. The chamber's bone-dry air and slow cross-draft had preserved the pages far beyond expectation. The handwriting was tight-hurried. June 3rd. We heard the first collapse this morning. 4 men trapped in the North Drift. No word from above. They said help is coming. The next page bore smudges that might have been water stains, or perhaps something else. June 5th. No sound from the main shaft. Food low. We can smell the fire but cannot reach it. Thomas believes they sealed the upper passage. He says they heard engines. Elliot read in silence, the words gripping him like a hand from the past. He turned the page again. June 8th. They are pouring concrete. We can hear it through the stone. I begged them to stop. Someone knocked back once, then nothing. We are not gone yet. Tell them. His voice caught in his throat. Mariah leaned over his shoulder, her expression stricken. He knew, she said. They were alive when it happened. Elliot closed the notebook gently, as if afraid it might break. He wrote this knowing no one would ever read it, he murmured. Outside the chamber, investigators carried out fragments of evidence. One handed Elliot a folder retrieved from the modern corporate archive sent that morning from Western Mineral Holdings headquarters. He opened it under the weak light of a portable lamp. The paperwork was sterile, neatly typed. Hallow Ridge Structural Failure Report, 1904. Transferred record. The summary was short. Total collapse, due to internal blast. Hazardous materials rendered site unsafe. Permanent sealing authorized. Again, no mention of survivors. No sign of the men who had written their last hours into the walls. Elliot looked from the new pages to the old notebook and felt the gulf between truth and record like a wound. They changed the story, he said quietly. They called it a collapse. They erased everything else. Mariah lifted her camera again, photographing both documents side by side, the clean, impersonal print against the frantic scrawl of pencil. People will believe what's written in ink, she said softly, but not what's written in dust. Elliot looked back toward the line of skeletons resting against the far wall, his chest tight. Not if we let them see both, he replied. He reopened the notebook, scanning the final entries. The handwriting grew shaky near the end, as if the writer's strength had failed him. June 10th. The air burns our throats. The lamps dim. If anyone finds this, tell my son that I worked until the end, that I did not stop trying. The last words were barely legible. Elliot's hand trembled slightly as he set it down. He had a son, just a child then, Elliot murmured. Mariah scribbled in her notes, her jaw tight. There are still Byron families around here, she said. They deserve to know. As the day wore on, the truth began to piece itself together like a dark mosaic. The silence in the records, the missing rescue logs, the language of liability that replaced the language of human life. Elliot sat back, rubbing his eyes. It wasn't an accident, he said finally. It was a decision. Mariah stopped writing and looked at him. And decisions leave signatures. She reached for her camera again, capturing the notebook under the harsh glare of her lamp. Every story leaves proof if you know where to look. Elliot rose to his feet, turning toward the deeper end of the passage. Beyond the reach of the lamps, the tunnel continued into shadow, untouched. "We found what they buried," he said, his voice low. "But I think there's still something they didn't want us to see." Mariah followed his gaze, her hand tightening around the strap of her camera as the light flickered against the black. The mountain, silent for more than a century, seemed to exhale again, as if waiting for them to step further into its truth. By the following morning, after the state explosives team had boxed and isolated the unstable nitroglycerin crates behind a temporary bulkhead, the investigation team withdrew to analyze their findings, leaving only Elliot, Mariah, and 3 experienced miners to continue the exploration beyond the main chamber. The air had grown colder, sharper, as if the mountain itself was reminding them they were trespassing in its lungs. Elliot led the way with cautious precision, only after verifying oxygen, carbon monoxide, and methane levels on the multigas meter, and shoring the weakest sets, his lamp beam cutting across uneven stone, while the others followed in single file. Each step trembled the ground. Dust shimmered briefly, then vanished. The passage ahead narrowed, the walls pressed close, and the floor tilted downward into what appeared to be an unfinished section of the mine. "Watch the ceiling," Elliot warned. These supports weren't designed for time. The timbers above were dark with moisture. Their grains split and bowed under invisible weight. A low groan passed through the rock, a sound like breath beneath stone. Mariah steadied her camera, focusing on Elliot's movements, her face pale but steady. "Do you ever get used to this?" she asked quietly. He gave a small, humorless smile. "You never do. You just learn how to listen." They passed through a narrow gap where the ceiling dipped low, forcing everyone to crouch. Beyond it, the tunnel opened into a wider space littered with broken planks and rusted tools. The scent of old oil mixed with earth, sharp and metallic. Elliot scanned the walls, noting fractures that ran in unnatural lines. "This area took secondary pressure," he said. "When the main shaft collapsed, the shock must have traveled here." Mariah frowned. So this wasn't just damage, it was chain reaction. Elliot nodded, moving his lamp toward a jagged column of rock that had cracked through a timber beam. "Exactly." He stepped closer, examining the pattern of the break. Then the ground shifted with a sudden crack like a whip. Instinctively, he froze. The column above him shuddered, small stones raining down from the ceiling. "Move," one of the miners shouted, but before Elliot could react, the column gave way with a deep, grinding snap. Mariah dropped her camera and lunged forward, grabbing his arm with both hands. They hit the ground as the rock slammed beside them, sound ricocheting through the tunnel. Dust filled the air, thick and choking. Elliot coughed, his heart hammering, realizing how close he had come. Mariah pressed a hand against his shoulder, her face streaked with dirt. "Are you all right?" she managed between breaths. He nodded slowly, still catching his breath. "You pulled me clear," he said. She smiled faintly, though her voice trembled. "You looked like you needed a hand." When the dust began to settle, they both sat in silence for a moment, the echo of the collapse fading into stillness. The others approached carefully, checking the stability of the surrounding supports. Elliot rose to his feet, brushing off debris. He looked at Mariah, and for the first time since they began, his voice softened. "Thank you." She adjusted her camera strap, giving a small nod. "Let's just say we're even for that ladder incident on day 2. He chuckled quietly, the sound almost foreign in the gloom. The brief moment of levity steadied them both. They moved deeper, their progress slower. Now each sound measured, each movement deliberate. The tunnel split ahead into 2 branches. Elliot studied the markings on the left-hand wall, faded chalk arrows barely visible. "This way," he said. "It's older, but it connects to the east drift." The air grew warmer as they advanced, suggesting some venting still existed through natural fissures. Then, Mariah's light caught something on the ground, a small metal box half buried in dust. "Hold on," she said, kneeling. The box was dented, but intact, its brass latch corroded, but still sealed. Elliot knelt beside her, examining it closely. "Could be a tool case," he said. Mariah shook her head. "Too small." "And look the engraving." On the lid, faint but visible, was the word mail. Elliot pried it open carefully with a knife. Inside were several sheets of folded paper browned with age and sealed in wax. He unfolded the top one, and the handwriting, though faded, was painfully clear. "June 9th. To my wife Ellen and my children, if this ever reaches you, know that I worked to the end. We waited for rescue until the lamps dimmed. Tell our boy to stay away from the mines. Tell him I loved him until the last light went out." Elliot's eyes lingered on the final line, his throat tight. "He was writing to say goodbye," he said quietly. Mariah's gaze met his, her own eyes, reflecting the faint beam of light. "He was trying to make sure someone remembered," she said. Elliot folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. "And someone will," he answered. The air felt heavier now, as if the weight of all those unsent words had settled on their shoulders. The team stood in silence, the only sound the faint creak of timber and the rhythmic drip of water deeper within the shaft. Elliot turned his light toward the far end of the tunnel, where the path descended again into darkness. "There's more beyond this point," he said. Mariah nodded, picking up her camera again. The dust had begun to clear, and the faint reflection of metal shimmered somewhere ahead, glinting like the edge of another secret waiting to be uncovered. The following days unfolded like slow breathing inside the mountain, careful, measured, filled with quiet reverence. The crew worked methodically, photographing every artifact, mapping every inch of the uncovered shafts. Mariah Quinn's camera clicked steadily, each flash catching fragments of the past preserved in dust, the steel handles of pickaxes worn smooth by calloused hands, scraps of fabric still clinging to rusted nails, a child's photograph tucked into a tin box blackened by time. Elliot Graves recorded the structural dimensions, sketching diagrams in his notebook with the precision of an engineer and the care of a historian. "Every piece matters," he told the team, his voice low but firm. "Each one tells what was left unsaid." The others nodded silently, understanding that their task had become something far beyond excavation. It was restitution. By the third day, the initial chamber had been cleared and catalogued, but Elliot's attention lingered on a narrow fissure along the far wall. It was small, just wide enough to slip a light through, but the air that drifted from it was colder, untouched. "There's another cavity beyond this section," he said, crouching to examine it. Mariah joined him, her headlamp beam slipping into the gap. "Do you think it's another tunnel?" she asked. Elliot nodded. "Maybe a shelter? The air feels different." They began clearing the obstruction by hand, stone by stone, until a space large enough for a person to crawl through emerged. Elliot went first, his movements slow, deliberate, every sound amplified by the closeness of the rock. When he finally reached the opening, his lamp revealed a small chamber no larger than a storage room. The air was stale, the silence absolute. Dust motes drifted like faint stars in the beam of his light. He lifted his headlamp and froze. Against the far wall sat a row of wooden crates stacked carefully, not like supplies abandoned in haste, but like barricades built with purpose. Beside them were tools, picks, shovels, and a lantern still hanging from a nail, the glass blackened but unbroken. Elliot moved closer, his steps cautious. The ground beneath him was covered in a layer of fine dust, undisturbed for over a century. Near the center of the chamber lay 3 bedrolls, arranged in a semicircle facing the entrance, each with remnants of fabric blankets folded neatly. He crouched, picking up a dented metal cup resting beside one of the rolls. It bore initials, scratched faintly into the rim, HB. The letters caught the light, just enough to make his pulse quicken. Mariah crawled in behind him, her voice soft but tense. "Elliot, what is it?" He turned the cup in his hand, his voice barely above a whisper. "Harold Byrne," he said. These were his things. Mariah's brow furrowed. "You're sure?" He nodded, slowly, eyes fixed on the objects around him. "I know the initials. I saw them on family documents when I was a boy. He was my great-grandfather's cousin." He set the cup down carefully, his hands trembling despite the cold. "He made it this far. He tried to live, The cracked lantern told the story, an attempt to keep light alive. Empty cans stacked in tidy rows hinted at the methodical endurance of men who refused to surrender to darkness. Near the corner, Elliot found a section of the wall that had been scratched repeatedly, vertical lines etched into the rock, a tally of days perhaps, or simply a way to remember time when time no longer mattered. He counted silently, 56. They held out nearly 2 months, he said. The tally marks continue long after the last entry in the journal when the pencil and lamp oil were gone. They counted the days into the rock. Warm? Mariah stood beside him, the faint flicker of her headlamp catching the moisture gathering in her eyes. They waited until the end, she whispered. Elliot ran his fingertips along the wall, markings feeling the grooves as if tracing the pulse of those who had carved them. He wasn't just a name in a record, he said. He was here. He breathed this air. He fought to stay alive. Mariah raised her camera, framing the scene carefully. The crates, the tools, the symbols of human endurance trapped in stone. "We'll make sure the world sees it," she said. Elliot nodded, his expression grave but resolute. They deserve that. Outside the chamber, the other miners called out, asking if they had found anything significant. Elliot hesitated before answering. "Everything here is significant," he said, stepping back into the crawl space. Mariah followed her camera light, sweeping one last time across the hidden room, lingering on the initials gleaming faintly on the cup. When they emerged, Elliot gave instructions for full preservation. "No drills near this section," he said firmly. "This isn't just a site, it's a memorial." The men nodded, their earlier rough demeanor replaced by quiet respect. Mariah approached him after a while, her voice gentler now. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" she asked. Elliot glanced toward the sealed fissure behind them, his jaw tight. "He was family," he said, "and I never even knew his story until now." She placed a hand on his arm, her touch steady. "You're giving it back to him," she said. "That's what matters." Elliot looked at her, gratitude flickering behind exhaustion. "Maybe," he said softly, "but it feels like he's giving something back to me too." He turned his headlamp toward the darkness ahead, where the tunnel curved deeper into the mountain. The beam caught a faint glimmer, something metallic reflecting from farther within. "There's more," he said under his breath. Mariah followed his gaze, adjusting her camera. "Then we keep going," she said quietly. The others gathered their gear, the sound of boots and tools blending into the slow heartbeat of the mountain as they prepared to step once more into the unseen. Outside, the snow had melted along the lower slopes of Hallow Ridge, revealing brown earth streaked with veins of stone, like the mountain itself had opened its scars to the sky. Weeks had passed since the discovery, yet the weight of it lingered in Elliot Graves' chest as he sat before a spread of technical diagrams and geological notes inside the temporary field office. The hum of generators blended with the faint scratching of his pen as he wrote the final pages of his report. Each word was deliberate, each measurement exact. He documented not just structural data, but evidence, the seals, the tool marks, the crates of explosives left untouched. Facts would have to carry what emotion could not. At the far end of the room, Mariah Quinn sat at her laptop, the light of the screen casting a pale glow over her tired face. Her fingers moved quickly, shaping the story that had haunted her since they first stepped into the tunnel. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The truth was enough. "I keep thinking about them," she said, suddenly breaking the quiet. Elliot looked up from his papers. "The miners." She nodded. They were fathers. Sons, brothers. They probably had letters waiting at home that never got answered. Elliot closed his notebook gently, his eyes distant. Now, after all these years, they'll finally be heard. 3 days later, Mariah's article was published. The front page of the Helena Tribune bore the headline, "Hallow Ridge, the mine that was sealed alive." The photographs were stark rows of tools covered in dust, a close-up of the scratched tally marks, the small metal cup bearing the initials HB. The story spread faster than either of them expected. National outlets picked it up. Radio hosts discussed it. Social media filled with outrage and sorrow. Families called authorities, tracing the surnames from the article. The Montana Historical Society verified 17 distinct family lines linked to the 1904 registry. When reporters reached some of those descendants, their reactions were recorded in trembling voices. "We always thought it was an accident." One elderly man said, tears catching in his throat, "My great-grandfather used to leave flowers by the ridge, said he could still hear the ground breathe. Now I know why." Another woman held a faded photograph to the camera, whispering, "He died working to feed us, and they left him there." Elliot watched the coverage from the quiet of his trailer, the television flickering in the dim light. He felt no triumph, only the ache of a burden too heavy to set down. Mariah knocked on the open door, a newspaper folded in her hand. "They're calling for a full inquiry," she said. He nodded slowly. "They should." She stepped inside and laid the paper on his desk. "Western Mineral Holdings issued a statement this morning," she added. He raised his eyebrows, and she took a breath. They confirmed the company's historical link to the original Hallow Mining Company. They said the sealing was a decision made under duress and expressed regret. Elliot leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Regret, he repeated softly the word, tasting hollow. After a century. The official inquiry that followed was swift and relentless. Journalists unearthed old shareholder records exposing how the decision to seal the mine had been made to avoid costly rescue operations. Letters between executives surfaced cold bureaucratic memos referring to the miners as non-recoverable assets and noting that projected rescue costs exceeded the value of remaining ore. The outrage grew. Historians called it one of the darkest cover-ups in Montana's industrial history. Protesters gathered outside the company's regional office, holding signs that read, "Open the truth, and their silence is our shame." Inside the conference halls, representatives of Western Mineral Holdings faced reporters with forced calm. "We cannot change the past," their spokesperson said, "but we are committed to honoring those who were lost." Elliot attended one of the hearings in Helena, seated quietly in the back of the room. The families of the miners filled the seats ahead of him, their faces lined with grief and pride. When the photograph of the underground shelter appeared on the projector, the one with the lantern and the initials, he felt his throat close. Mariah sat beside him, notebook in hand, her gaze fixed forward. The moderator read excerpts from the recovered journal entries, each word echoing in the silent chamber. "We can hear them sealing it. Tell my son I worked until the end." A woman in the front row sobbed softly into her hands. Elliot's eyes found hers, though he didn't know her name. He thought of Harold Byrne, of the men who had sat in that darkness waiting for air that never came. When the session ended, reporters crowded around the exits. Mariah stopped just outside the courthouse steps, turning to him. "They're talking about building a memorial at Hallow Ridge," she said. Elliot looked past her toward the distant line of mountains. "They should build more than that," he said quietly. "They should build an apology that lasts longer than stone." She nodded, her expression somber. "You'll have to speak at the dedication, you know." He gave a faint smile. "I'd rather let the evidence speak." She studied him for a moment. "But you're the one who found them." Elliot looked down at his hands, still marked with faint streaks of dust that never quite washed away. "No," he said after a pause. "They found us." That evening, as the sun fell behind the ridges, the sky glowed with a deep orange haze that painted the mountains in gold. Elliot stood outside the camp watching the light fade. Somewhere in that fading glow, he imagined the miners' faces, men who had lived and worked and hoped in a world that forgot them. The air was still carrying the faint scent of iron and pine. Behind him, Mariah's voice called softly. "Elliot, they want us back at the ridge tomorrow. There's something else they want to show you." He turned toward her, the dying light catching the edge of his expression. "Something else?" he asked. She nodded. "Another section's been cleared. They think it leads deeper." The last descent into Hallow Ridge came at dawn, when the light outside was soft and silver, and the mist clung to the trees like a veil that refused to lift. Elliot Graves walked behind the team one final time, his boots stirring fine dust along the narrow tunnel as their lights flickered against the damp stone. The air carried the faint scent of oil and rust, the same smell that had followed them for weeks, though it no longer seemed suffocating. It felt like the mountain had finally exhaled at peace. Ahead, Mariah Quinn was speaking quietly with a curator from the Montana State Museum, explaining how each section of the site would be preserved. "We're not taking anything out," she said firmly. "These artifacts belong here. They've waited too long to be touched again." The curator nodded his gloved hands, gentle, as he adjusted a protective tarp over the old mining cart, now stabilized and framed by support beams. The air hummed faintly from the portable lights, giving the chamber a strange warmth, like a sanctuary built beneath the earth. Elliot moved closer to the sealed alcove, where Harold Barnes' initials were etched into the cup they had found. The museum team had left the space undisturbed, marking it off with thin ropes and a small sign that read, "Preserved Area in Memory of the Hallow Ridge Miners." He crouched for a moment, studying the faint groove marks on the wall, the tally lines still visible beneath the dust. They looked softer now, as if the stone itself had relaxed under the weight of remembrance. Outside the tunnel entrance, the world was awake again. Reporters gathered at a respectful distance, their cameras lowered, their voices subdued. The storm of headlines had settled into something quieter, a tone of mourning and acknowledgement. Western Mineral Holdings had publicly accepted responsibility, and though no amount of statements could undo what had been done, they had agreed to fund a memorial and educational exhibit to ensure the story would never fade from record again. Mariah stood near the entrance, notebook in hand, her hair swept by the mountain wind. She looked up as Elliot approached her, smile, tired but full of quiet triumph. "They're closing it today," she said. "After that, the site's under museum protection. It'll stay sealed, but for the right reasons this time." Elliot nodded, his gaze following the line of the mountain, where the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. "That's how it should be," he said softly. "Let them rest where they stood." The rest of the crew began packing equipment, their voices low. No one rushed, no one joked. Every motion was deliberate, as if they were guests leaving a sacred place. Mariah finished her notes and slipped her camera into its case. "You know," she said, turning toward him, "I think they knew someone would find them one day. Those carvings, the letters, they were messages for us." Elliot considered this, his eyes drifting toward the dark mouth of the tunnel. "Maybe that's what truth does," he said. "It waits until someone's ready to listen." She smiled faintly, adjusting her jacket against the cold. "And you listened," she said. "You made sure they were heard." He looked at her, then the lines of fatigue and dust still etched across his face, but softened by a quiet calm. "We both did," he said. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of the wind filled the silence, rustling the sparse grass along the ridge. Below, the valley stretched wide and golden, dotted with the faint shimmer of rivers winding through the early light. It was a landscape that had swallowed grief for a century, and now it seemed to exhale something gentler acceptance. When the last piece of equipment was loaded into the trucks, Elliot walked alone toward the edge of the ridge. From there, he could see the entire slope, the sealed entrance now framed by wooden supports and a newly placed bronze plaque waiting to be unveiled. His reflection caught faintly in the metal surface, his face merging with the engraved words, "For the men of Hallow Ridge," whose light endured beyond darkness. He ran a gloved hand across the cold bronze, feeling the texture of each letter. Mariah's voice called from behind him. "They're ready to go." He turned slightly, his eyes lingering on the plaque one last time. "Go ahead," he said. "I'll follow in a minute." She nodded and walked back toward the convoy, leaving him with the mountain and the wind. Elliot stayed still, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where sunlight spilled across the peaks. He thought of Harold Byrne, and the others, their final moments, their hope that someone might remember. He thought of the letter that never reached its family, the words carved into stone. "Tell them I worked until the end." The air was cold on his face, the kind that felt clean, unburdened. He spoke quietly, his voice almost a whisper, carried off by the wind. "The truth will be kept," he said, "and the light of those who were lost will never go out." The breeze moved gently through the grass, rustling like a sigh. Behind him, the workers began sealing the safety barriers, their voices faint under the hum of machinery. The tunnel's mouth glowed faintly with the reflection of the morning sun, before fading into shadow once more, this time not as a tomb, but as a monument. Elliot turned away, walking slowly towards the trucks where Mariah waited. She waited by the passenger door, watching him quietly. "You ready?" she asked. He gave a small nod, glancing once more at the ridge. "As I'll ever be." They climbed into the cab, the engine starting with a low rumble. As the convoy wound down the mountain road, the plaque above caught the last gleam of sunlight. A single beam cutting across the engraved words like a promise held in metal and memory. Far above them, the ridge stood silent, its heart no longer buried in secrecy, but resting beneath a sky that had finally learned how to bear the truth. If this story touched you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real mysteries like this one. Which moment stayed with you the most? The letter, the journal, or Elliot's final promise? Share your thoughts and tell me where you're watching from in the comments below.